You've been liaising with some of the people who are going to make decisions on these antitrust issues at these federal agencies. What's your argument to them?
So, Emily, here's the thing. The tone of the government has changed so dramatically in recent months because I think there is an awareness everywhere that especially Google and Facebook, but also Amazon and Apple, have issues that really are bad for the economy, they're bad for competitors, and they're bad for consumers. And as a consequence, you see all of the big four being investigated at the moment. But the cases are very, very different. The one against Apple, I think, is trivial because it relates to the App Store, and I think it can be resolved by them changing the way they price to the developer. The one at Amazon is more structural, but again, I think Amazon provides a really valuable service in a way that will survive antitrust investigation, even if they have to make pretty profound changes. For Google and Facebook, the game is completely different because the issues go to the heart of their business models, and there is no easy fix. That doesn't mean that the antitrust investigations will lead to actions that change their business models, but I do believe that the investigations are going to look really seriously at ways to force changes in the business model.
Now, all we know is that the DOJ and FTC have divided oversight over possible investigations. What's your sense of whether these investigations into all four of these companies will actually happen?
So, Emily, I'm obviously not in a position to know the answer to that question. I surely would love to know the answer, but I don't. Here's what I believe, that there are signals coming out of FTC relative to Facebook that are inescapable, right? We've even heard, indications that it might be a $5 billion fine, that there would be other actions resulting from the violations of the consent decree from 2011. There is more evidence, as we saw earlier this week, the Wall Street Journal reporting that there may be evidence that Mark Zuckerberg knew about the privacy violations that were taking place. And in that context, if that evidence proves to be valid, this situation, I think, has to become more extreme than even what's been discussed. I don't think a $5 billion fine is going to move the needle on Facebook. I think the market's discounted that. But I don't think we should assume that's all there is on that case. On Google, I think we're earlier in the process. I think the situation is very clear-cut in two different ways. Google's monopoly in search, in advertising, and on Android are so powerful and so obvious that it's really impossible for me to imagine that the Department of Justice won't initiate some kind of investigation, and we'll have to see where that leads. So
let's stick with Facebook. What do you think actually would move the needle? I mean, obviously, co-founder Chris Hughes, one of the earliest employees at Facebook, has argued for breaking up Facebook. Sheryl Sandberg has in part responded saying, well, China isn't going to break up its big tech companies. And to a certain extent, we heard Sundar Pichai making that same argument to CNN. Yeah. Bigger can be better and more successful.
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious that bigger has been fantastic for shareholders. I think that in terms of broad competitiveness and especially innovation, big has been a disaster. The Silicon Valley entrepreneurial community has seen its entire world distorted. Effectively, you have to avoid, every startup has to have a plan for avoiding Google and Facebook. And it essentially has driven a ton of money into businesses that are more capital intensive, like services your parents used to provide for you, or into things that are higher risk and probably lower return, like crypto and like transportation, like scooters. So in my mind, the case here for doing the investigation is clear cut. I think the China rationale is nonsense. Where I think that the regulation needs to go two ways. You need antitrust to improve the competitive environment. I would look to the way AT&T was handled, where the patent portfolio was put into the public domain, where they were restricted to a space smaller than they were competing in, and where their own infrastructure was used to create competitors. I think all three of those work here. I think you also have to go after the core business model. You have to go after what the Harvard scholar Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism. This notion that these companies can either acquire or through surveillance capture a data avatar, really a data voodoo doll for each person in the population, and then use that for their own gain over the objections or without the knowledge of the consumer. I think that business model is extremely dangerous, and we're going to need a different kind of regulation there, one that's new to this kind of economy. It'll probably take a while, but that is a very important thing to do, and I think regulators are aware of that.
Regulation is one thing, a breakup is another thing. Do you believe that Facebook and Google should be broken up, and if so, how?
Well, so, Emily, I think there are lots of ways to look at this. Most of the discussion to date has been about the merger activity that shouldn't have happened, right? And therefore unwinding things like Instagram and WhatsApp at Facebook, unwinding the mapping products at Google and some of the other things that Google's acquired. I think you have to look at all the alternatives. When they broke up AT&T, they broke it up horizontally. They broke it up by region. I think you have to look at every possibility. But at the end of the day, breakup will not be helpful if you do not go after the business model. Again, what Professor Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism is itself a very severe problem for the economy and especially for consumers. It's the reason why we face threats to public health, democracy, privacy, and competition. And so you have to go after that. And in order to do that, I mean, you can't just break them up and leave them alone. You have to deal with the business model at the same time.